Oops, I can't have a virtual background. Ta-da! Hello, YouTube. Hello, people who are watching. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes for people to join us before we start sharing some ideas about Pesach. That although this year is one that indeed is going to go down in the history books as one that is not ideal for so many reasons, and yet we're going to discover so many things about Pesach, about ourselves, about how we run our seders that perhaps normally on a normal year we wouldn't find out. So it's a great year to share some ideas and inspirations on the topic of Pesach. And I guess, wherever you are, whatever you're doing in the world this Pesach, whether it's you're by yourself, whether you do have the good fortune of being able to spend it with family, then you'll have the opportunity to at least share a new perspective and enjoy Pesach this year with something a bit more meaningful. So that's what I'd like to do this evening. For those who are watching, those who are just signing in now, please feel free to post comments, post questions on the chat at the side of the screen, and I'll try my best to address them as we share some thoughts together. I'm gonna begin shortly, but for those just signing in now, just by way of introduction, I'm going to hopefully share some ideas and thoughts and collaborate together to hopefully make this year's Pesach something meaningful, something interesting, that despite the fact that we're in isolation, despite the fact that we're by ourselves, there's no reason that Pesach shouldn't be just as more meaningful and just as exciting and just as deep as it normally is. So it's a tremendous opportunity, despite all that's going on in the world, to really think about what Pesach could be. So just to begin to think about this, and this is something that I often consider myself, and that is that very often when we think about Jewish stories, we remember the stuff that we were taught in kindergarten, the stuff that we were taught in nursery, and for some reason, which is a little bit bizarre, we never kind of move on from that. We never challenge and readdress some of the fundamentals, readdress some of the stories, readdress some of the questions after we grow up, after our mind matures, and after we have the ability to think like adults. We never readdress those questions, and sometimes it's like, we're stuck in our childish 5-year-old selves, and the answers to some of those questions which we were taught when we were 3 or 4 years old stay with us. And then what's worse than that is that sometimes later on in life we actually re-ask those questions, and because we've got our 4-year-old answers in our head, we think, hey, that's absolutely ridiculous, that's absurd, to the point that actually we kind of end up throwing a lot out from the traditions. That we basically give ourselves these 4-year-old answers, and our adult brain is telling us that's ridiculous. We're so comfortable, we're so familiar with the idea of things making sense on an adult level, that when we come across something in Judaism that makes sense so basically and so simply, that we don't address the Jewish attitude towards things as the way that they should be. So I think it would be fair to say that a good way to address the story of Pesach is to start asking those questions again. Start asking the fundamental questions about what is Pesach, what are we looking to achieve on Seder night, what are we looking to gain from it, and address that with our adult minds, and try and move away a little bit from our nursery understanding of it. That's what I like to do with any Jewish idea, and perhaps tonight's the night to address Pesach with that fresh set of eyes. So I'd like to begin, and what I want to do is ask a few questions that are based on some of the sources that we are familiar with, and some of which that we're less familiar with when it comes to Pesach. Ask some fundamental questions, and hopefully tie together all of those questions with a beautiful answer that will actually shift our perspective on what's going on Pesach, and also what is going on Seder night, which is so bizarre. If you had to rank and list off the strange Jewish customs, then I think probably right at the top of them, somewhere at the top 5, you'd have Seder night. Some of the stuff we do on Seder night is very, very interesting, and it's almost like begging the question, why are we doing it like that? Why are we snapping a matzah in half? Why are we putting it in a special little bag and hiding it and then offering presents to people? It seems a little bit bizarre. So that's the beginning question. What on earth's going on? But I want to go a little bit deeper and look at some of the sources. Now, one of the interesting sources, this is a weird one because I would normally say, what if you went to shul 2 weeks ago, which most people, if you go to shul, you would have experienced this. But at the moment, 2 weeks ago, unfortunately, most people did not go to shul. Most people were unable to hear the Torah reading that week. But if you did, then you would have heard us reading the portion of Parashat HaChodesh. Parashat HaChodesh is a very interesting portion because it starts off with the commandment of the Jewish people to start keeping something called Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh is the first day of the month. Like Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, Rosh Chodesh is the beginning of the month. And the Jewish people are given this commandment as we left Egypt, that we've got to start keeping Rosh Chodesh, and that's kind of the intro. This commandment is the intro to the whole story of Pesach. And that's what we read about 2 weeks ago, if we would have been in shul, but we're not. But if we would have been, then we would have read about this mitzvah of keeping Rosh Chodesh. The question is, what on earth has this got to do with the story of Pesach? Why is it that when it comes to the week before the month in which Pesach falls, we suddenly have to start reading about the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh? What's that got to do with Pesach? Second question is, why is the intro of the portion that talks about Pesach in the Torah, why is that the mitzvah of keeping Rosh Chodesh? That's a bit strange. But I like to point out something like this. Nachmanides, the Ramban, brings this idea that most people have not heard of. He says that there is actually a mitzvah that so many people are unaware of. In fact, it's not even codified by all the codifiers of the mitzvot. He says there is a mitzvah not just to remember the fact that the Jewish people left Egypt, but there's a mitzvah to remember the month that we left Egypt as well, which is the Jewish month of Nisan. Who ever heard of such a mitzvah? Who ever heard that there's a mitzvah to remember the month that we left Egypt? And not only that, who ever heard of it, but why? What's the significance of the month? Now, there's something interesting about the Jewish calendar, specifically about the month when Pesach falls. I don't know if anyone out there watching is familiar with this idea, that the Jewish calendar is very unique. The Gregorian calendar that the England follows, the Western world follows, is based on the Christian calendar. The Christian calendar revolves around the sun. It's a solar calendar. Now, the Muslims follow a lunar calendar. Right? For anyone who has colleagues who are of the Muslim faith, they will understand that certain festivals, that they're actually, to this day, they're not sure when the festivals fall. They kind of have to wait for a ruling regarding exactly when the dates fall in the Gregorian calendar so that they can know which days to take off, etc. Anyone employing people of Islamic faith would be aware of this. Their festivals change date, at least in English terms, in the Gregorian calendar each year. But when you think about Judaism and the calendar that we form, you ask yourself, 1 second, do we follow the lunar or the solar calendar? And very quickly you'll learn that actually Jewish people follow both. We actually merge the two together, right? So you'll always find that Pesach is around April. Now that doesn't make sense, hang on a minute, but I thought the Jewish calendar works in Hebrew months, which are lunar months, right? But you'll find that there is also a concept in the Jewish calendar that actually fuses together the two, because we have leap years, right? Every few years we have a Jewish leap year. We add on an entire month in order that the lunar calendar and the solar calendar should come together. Now, in the Gregorian calendar, we don't do that. The only reason we have leap years in the Gregorian calendar is just because there aren't, in fact, the Earth going around the sun doesn't take 365 days. It takes 365 and a bit days. And therefore, every few years, we have to have a leap year. But in Jewish thinking, the leap year is actually to merge the two calendars together. So actually, we follow a solar and a lunar calendar. Now, how do we know? What is the source that the Jewish people are supposed to merge those two calendars? You want to know the source? The source is the month of Pesach. Because it says that Pesach has to fall in the spring, and we know that the spring and the seasons of the year are dictated by the sun, not the moon. Therefore, we know that the Jewish festivals have to coincide with the solar calendar. And if that's true, then the lunar and solar calendar have to mesh together at some point. So you see that the month that Pesach falls in is significant, not just because the Nachmanides says that we actually have an obligation to remember the month that we left Egypt, but there's also something significant about this month in that it is the month that we learn about the obligation for the Jewish people to merge together the two calendars. Very interesting. So you see, literally, the Jewish people live in our own time. We have our own calendar, which operates completely differently to every other nation on the face of the planet. As far as I'm aware, no other nation has a calendar that uses solar and lunar calendars together. But please correct me if I'm wrong. If anyone out there wants to Google that and see if there is another culture on the planet that uses both the solar and lunar calendar together, it'll be very interesting. Very interesting. It doesn't do anything to the point that we're sharing tonight, but if you would like to find out more about that and see if there is someone out there who has a similar calendar to us, that would be very interesting. But I'd like to ask the question again, what is the significance of the month? Why this month? That's question number 2. Question number 1 is why on earth are we doing all these strange things? Number 2, the generic question of why this month. The Nachmanides says an obligation to remember it. We know that we read the Torah portion specially for it. We know that it's the introduction to the whole story in the Torah of Pesach is this mitzvah of keeping Rosh Chodesh. And the question is why? And then finally, this idea that this is the month that actually is produces the obligation for us to merge calendars together. That's another question. I'd like to tie all the questions together with a principle, an understanding of what took place when the Jewish people left Egypt, and an understanding of what we're trying to achieve through the mitzvah of Seder night, which is the central biblical commandment of Seder night. Is people think, the 4 cups of wine? No, 4 cups of wine is rabbinic law, but really the central focus and the focal point of the whole Haggadah, the whole Seder, is the mitzvah, the biblical commandment, to tell over the story of Pesach, to tell over the story of the Jews leaving Egypt. Now what's amazing, and this will be like the end, the cherry on top of the questions, is when the Maimonides, not to be confused with the Nachmanides, the Rambam, as opposed to the Ramban, the Nachmanides, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, when he's describing the mitzvah, the obligation to relate to our children, to teach to our children the story of the Exodus, the one thing that he misses out when he's describing it is the Exodus. He says you have an obligation to relate to your children about all the miracles that took place to our ancestors in Egypt. But he doesn't say, when he's describing the mitzvah, the obligation to relate to your mature children who understand what happens. And he says, obviously, you have to teach your children according to their level and according to their understanding. But when it comes to the wise son, we know in the Haggadah, we talk about 4 sons, and the Maimonides also talks about different levels of child and their ability to understand. When it comes to the wise son, he says, you know what your obligation is? Don't tell him that we left Egypt. Tell him there were miracles that happened when we were in Egypt. That's bizarre. The mitzvah of relating the story of the Exodus, the one thing you'd think would be really important to include is the Exodus, and yet the one thing he excludes is the Exodus, and that's bizarre. So that's a real question on top that really is going to be the catalyst to the answer, which is actually going to lead us to a little bit of an answer for all of those questions together, and it lies in the following principle. I'll say the principle, you can sum it up in one sentence, and then, of course, we'll have to develop that and explain it a little bit more. The principle is as follows. There are 2 parts to the Exodus. There are 2 facets to the Jewish people leaving Egypt. There's one, which is the Jewish people leaving Egypt, and there's 2, which is Egypt leaving the Jewish people. There are 2 parts to us leaving Egypt. And in fact, what is really important is the second part. The fact that we physically were in Egypt, enslaved in Egypt, is one thing. And the fact that we left, that's great. And obviously we celebrate that, and that's fantastic. But what we're really celebrating is the fact that Egypt left us. Egypt left the Jewish people. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean? What is Egypt? What does it symbolize? And what does it mean that it left the Jewish people? Now, to try and understand this a little bit is really requires a little bit of a step-by-step, because I think I'm going to explain it at least theoretically, but I'm going to leave the question, at least for now, and we'll get to it afterwards, but leave the question of how does that practically make sense. Let's not think practically. Let's understand what was going on, what Mitzrayim represents, and Then, after we've understood that, we can then ask the question of practically, what does that mean for us? What does it mean that we should be doing? What does it mean that we're supposed to achieve through the mitzvah? And then we'll have a better understanding of how we can achieve those things. And it goes like this. I think this is a proper way to understand this. And that is that the Jewish people shifted gears. We shifted from being a nation operating under a solar year, which in Hebrew is always called Shana. Shana is a year in Hebrew. Rosh Hashanah is the head of the year. We shifted from being a nation of Shana, which for those Hebrew speakers watching understand, Shana is not just a year, but is also a repetition. Something repetitive is Shana. Sheni is second, right? Secondary multiply. Shana is repetition. Something repeats itself. Something is repetitious. We call it Shana in Hebrew. That is the solar calendar. The idea behind the solar calendar is that which represents everything that repeats. Now, in another language or in other words, we might describe that as the natural system of law and order. The way that we would define nature is that which happens again and again. When something breaks the norm, that's unnatural. Something that repeats itself again and again, that's what we call nature. Teva in Hebrew. Teva. Nature is that which is represented by Shana, the year. When it comes to the month, the lunar calendar, which the Jewish people are commanded upon exit from Egypt to start keeping, it's HaChodesh Hazelachem. This idea is you are no longer bound by the Shana, by the year. You're no longer bound by nature. The Jewish people are moving and leaving that time zone entirely and entering into a new realm, which is Chodesh, the lunar month. What's the root of the word Chodesh? Chidush. Chidush is something new, newness, the opposite of repetition, something radically different. You've gone from Shana, which is repetition, to Chidush, to Chodesh, which is new, newness. The idea that the Jewish people left being a nation that were subject to the rules and boundaries and limitations of nature, and we left that and became a nation unbound by nature. We left the entire paradigm of what Shana is, and we moved into a dimension called above nature, Chidush, full of newness, full of miracles. And you can begin to start tasting what it was that the Maimonides is hinting to when he says the mitzvahs are all about telling over the miracles. Forget about the fact that we left Egypt. That part of the Exodus that's for the babies who don't understand anything. This is something much deeper. The fact that Egypt left us, the fact that the boundaries and limitations that represent the natural world of law and order actually left the Jewish people to the point that we are no longer subject to nature. We're a miraculous nation, living in a different plane to everything else. That's what happened. That's what the Jewish people became. Now, it's no coincidence, by the way, that Shana, the very word that we said represents the solar calendar, that represents repetition, that represents natural law and order, has the same numerical value as Paro, as Pharaoh. Because Paro in the Torah is the king of Egypt, the symbol of what Egyptian culture is. We're breaking away from that. We're leaving the Shana behind. We're leaving the repetition of natural law and order behind and becoming a nation of miracles. Now, it's also no coincidence that the country that we left is called Mitzrayim, which in Hebrew, the word Meitzarim, same letters, different vowels. Meitzarim is boundaries, limitations. We broke through that. We left that behind and became a nation of miracles. You want to know why it's so important, the month when Pesach falls? Because the month when Pesach falls, is symbolic of the fact that we're changing our time zone. We're no longer operating in the world of Shana, of the world of the solar calendar. We are operating in a different plane entirely of HaChodesh Hazelachem, of Chidush, of newness. That's where we're holding. That's why the beginning of that process, which is the very first step out of Egypt, when we first got the commandment of keeping Rosh Chodesh, that's when that falls in. And that's why it's important to remember that, because that's where the whole point of leaving Egypt, or Egypt leaving us, is starting. And you want to understand why the Maimonides says the main focus is to relate about the miracles, because that's the main part of the fact that we left Egypt, is that we became a nation of miracles. We became a nation of miracles. That's key to understanding everything that happens beyond that. The question I'd like to finish with, which is really what I mentioned before, is what does that mean for us? How are we in the 21st century supposed to sit there and feel like we're a nation of miracles? And I believe the answer to that is hinted to at two very important parts of the Seder, the Haggadah that we read. One of them is where we say, B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation, chayiv adam, a person is obligated, laharot et atzmo, or lirot et atzmo, to view himself, or to display, ke'ilu hu yatzam mitzrayim, as if you yourself left Egypt. That's your responsibility. Every year you have to view yourself as if you left Egypt. And I always wondered, why is it that we say B'chol dor v'dor, in every generation? Surely the correct terminology should every year, not every generation, every year we should focus and realize and connect with this idea that it's as if we left Egypt. The answer to that question is because no, what you're trying to do is connect to this idea that you are a nation that lives beyond natural law and order. You are a miraculous nation. You want to connect to that? Don't think about every year. You're not going to see it. But think about every generation, because when you take a longer, broader view of Jewish history, you begin to realize that you sitting in the 21st century at a Seder table, talking about the miracles that took place to the Jewish people way back when we were in Egypt, is the single greatest miracle that you could possibly imagine. The fact that there could be a Jew sitting at a Seder table 2,000 years, 3,500 years after we left Egypt. Despite the fact that in every generation there have been another nation that have risen up against us, and you can begin to see the theme that I'm talking about in the Seder night. Despite the fact that we've been persecuted more than any nation in the history on the face of the planet, you realize that it's not so difficult to realize that we are a nation of miracles. There couldn't be a bigger miracle. You read about the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea in the Haggadah, and you realize that is nothing compared to the fact that you're sitting here today, alive, healthy, hopefully in a healthy state. In today's day and age, it's crazy. We're going to be sitting sometimes alone this year. And yet, the fact that you're sitting having a Seder night is the single greatest miracle that you could possibly imagine, that goes and supersedes and is greater than the fact that we had 10 plagues, greater than the fact that the sea was split for us. That's the greatest miracle. When you take a generational view, not b'chol shana b'shana, not every year, but take a longer, broader perspective and see the miracle. And that's why, of course, as I mentioned before, the other time that we use that phrase in the Haggadah, b'chol dor v'dor, as is quoted very often in the famous song, but it was there before the song, b'chol dor v'dor, omdim aleinu lechalotenu, there is some other nation, there are people that get up and try and destroy the Jewish people. We went through such struggle and persecution. V'hakadosh baruch hu matzilenu mi'adam, but in every generation, Hashem saves us from that. Hashem protects us from that. As a result of that, we are still here. We're still able to sit down and have a Seder. A person who can take that generational view is able to connect with this idea that the Jewish people broke through the boundaries of Mitzrayim, broke through the boundaries of Paro, who represents Shana, the solar year that represents the entire world and system of natural law and order. We defy the laws of nature. The Jewish people, every single Jew defies the laws of nature, the fact that we're Jewish and that we're here. And that's something that is supposed to be experienced by every single Jew around the world on Seder night as they go through and relate that story every year with their family. And that is an idea that I think should be an inspiration to us this year, particularly whether you're with family or without family, you're able to sit at home and sit down wherever you are, whatever situation you're in, and appreciate that the fact that you're sitting down having a Seder, whether you're an NHS worker who has to rush back somewhere else, and you're able to sit down at some point, even in like in a staff room in a hospital, wherever it is, and you sit down, you have a matzah, you have a cup of wine, that's the biggest miracle that could possibly be imagined. And it's with that idea, I guess I leave you to think about, and I hope that you enjoy wherever you may be spending Pesach this year. Really connect with this idea, understand that being a Jew is a very, very special privilege, and it's an incredible opportunity to really connect with the concept of what Pesach is supposed to be, what the Jewish people became when we left Egypt, or more accurately, when Egypt left us. Chag kasher v'sameach. I hope everyone has a beautiful Yom Tov, a beautiful Pesach. Now, I'll stick around. If anyone has any more questions that they want to post in the chat bar, I can try and address it now. Otherwise, please feel free to comment or contact me afterwards. I'm told this is a really important. If you've enjoyed this class, if you've enjoyed this session, stay tuned for Aish UK are hosting every evening at 8 p.m. a class like this in the lead up to Pesach. The easiest way and the simplest way to find out about everything going on at Aish UK is subscribe to our YouTube channel, which you can do by clicking subscribe below this video. Thank you so much for those who have joined me. Thank you if you're watching on the not live presentation. I hope you'd enjoyed as well. And again, I wish you all Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Have a beautiful, beautiful Pesach.